There is a moment most of us know. Not a dramatic moment necessarily. Sometimes it's quiet. It's the moment when you look at a situation, a relationship, a dream, a version of yourself you used to believe in, and something inside you whispers, "This is finished. The chapter is closed. The story has already decided how it ends." And you learn slowly to build your life around that closed door. What I want to talk to you about today is a man named Jesus. And the single most consistent, radical, world-altering thing he ever did was walk into finished stories and refuse to accept things. He was an interrupter. Not a polite one. Not one who waited to be invited. He interrupted shame. He interrupted grief. He interrupted death itself. And in every case, the people involved had already made their peace, or their prison, with how things were. Let's start with a man named Zacchaeus. Now, you may know the name from a Sunday school song, but let's slow down and actually look at this man. Zacchaeus was a chief tax collector in Jericho. In first-century Judea, that wasn't just a job, it was a declaration of allegiance. Tax collectors worked for Rome. They collected more than was required and pocketed the difference. They were considered traitors by their own community, collaborators with the empire that had crushed their people. And Zacchaeus wasn't just a tax collector, he was the chief one. He was excellent at betrayal. By the time Jesus came through Jericho, Zacchaeus had built an entire architecture of living above people, literally. He climbs a sycamore tree to see Jesus pass by. Think about that. He's a wealthy man. He could have sent someone ahead. He could have stood at the front of the crowd. Instead, he climbs a tree alone, above everyone, watching from a distance. That's not curiosity. That's the behavior of a man who has accepted that he is not welcome among people. He has learned to watch life from a height. And Jesus, walking through a massive crowd surrounded by noise and need, stops, looks up, sees him, and says, "Zacchaeus, come down. I'm coming to your house today. Not I see you are interested in spiritual matters. Not perhaps later we can arrange a meeting." He interrupts the man's exile. He speaks his name in public. He announces a visit. The crowd is scandalized. He has gone to be the guest of a sinner, they mutter. And Zacchaeus comes down, the scripture says, immediately, and something in him breaks open. He stands before Jesus and announces he will give half his possessions to the poor and repay 4 times over anyone he has cheated. Jesus didn't lecture him about his sin. He just showed up. He interrupted the story of a man who had decided he was too far gone to belong anywhere. That's the first interruption, the interruption of shame. But Jesus didn't only interrupt the shame of the living, he interrupted the grief of the devastated. In a town called Nain, a funeral procession was moving through the gate. A widow was walking behind the body of her only son. In that culture, in that time, a widow without a son wasn't just bereaved, she was economically destroyed. Without a male guardian, she had no inheritance rights, no social standing, no safety net. She was walking behind her son's body toward the end of her own life as she had known it. Everyone in that procession had already accepted the story. The young man was dead, the mother was ruined. These were just the facts. Jesus was coming in through the same gate from the other direction. He saw her, and the scripture says something remarkable. It says he had compassion on her. But the Greek word used there, the word translated as compassion, is splanchnisomai. It means something almost violent, a stirring in the gut, a physical ache. He didn't observe her suffering from a theological distance. Something in him moved, viscerally, at the sight of her grief. He touched the coffin, which under Jewish purity law made him ritually unclean. He didn't calculate the religious cost. He reached out and touched it, and he said, "Young man, I say to you, arise." And the young man sat up, and Jesus gave him back to his mother. No one asked him to do this. There was no petition, no plea, no prayer meeting that brought Jesus to that road that day. He simply walked into a finished story, a story where death had already had the final word, and interrupted it. Because compassion in Jesus is not a feeling that leads to sympathy. It is a force that leads to action. He could not walk past her grief and leave it undisturbed. That's the second interruption, the interruption of despair. But the third one is the one that changes everything. When Jesus received word that his friend Lazarus was gravely ill, he waited, he delayed. He let the illness run its course. By the time he arrived in Bethany, Lazarus had been dead for 4 days. Martha came out to meet him on the road, and even in her grief she said, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." She believes in his power, but she's already conjugating it in the past tense. Even his own disciples think the story is over. Even Mary, when she comes out weeping, falls at his feet with the same line, "If you had been here, everyone has already accepted the ending, and then something happens that has always stopped me." Jesus, who knows what he is about to do. Jesus, who has already told Martha that Lazarus will rise. Jesus, who holds in himself the power of resurrection. Jesus weeps. He sees Mary weeping. He sees the mourners weeping, and he is deeply moved. Troubled, the scripture says he wept. Not performed grief, not a symbolic tear. He wept. Because he is not a God who stands outside suffering and directs it from a distance. He enters it. He walks into the middle of the grief before he dismantles it. He feels the weight of death before he overturns it. And then he goes to the tomb, and he calls Lazarus out, and Lazarus comes out. This is not merely a miracle story. This is a declaration about the nature of Jesus. He is not impressed by death's certainty. He is not limited by finality. He walks into the place where the world says nothing more can be said, and he speaks. Here is what I want you to sit with. Jesus is described in the Gospel of John as the same one through whom all things were made. The Word, present at creation, now walking through human history, and everywhere he walks, he is still creating, still speaking things into being that weren't there before, still interrupting the darkness and saying, "Let there be light." And if that is true, if that is even possibly true, then the question it asks of you and me is profoundly personal. What is the story you have already decided is finished? What is the thing you have made your peace with, built your walls around, climbed a tree above? Because you've accepted that it's simply how things are now. Is it a version of yourself you gave up on? A broken relationship you've buried, a calling you silenced because the road closed, a grief you've learned to carry because no one told you it could be interrupted. Jesus is not waiting for the perfect moment or the perfect person. He walked into the story of a corrupt tax collector eating lunch in a tree. He walked into a funeral he wasn't invited to. He walked to a 4-day-old tomb and called a man by name. He interrupts. That is who he is. That is what he does. And the most astonishing part of this is not what he did for Zacchaeus or the widow or Lazarus. The most astonishing part is that he is described, even now, as the same yesterday, today, and forever, which means the interrupting didn't stop. It just moved closer. It moved toward you. Whatever story you think has already been written, he's still walking toward it. And he has never once accepted an ending that he did not write himself.